Hello and welcome to the Extremis Publishing Podcast. I'm Tom Christie, and it's a great pleasure to be joined today by a brand new friend of the podcast and also a brand new author here at Extremis, although someone who's actually a very experienced writer just happens to be new to our stable of authors. His name is the Reverend Dr. Alasdair Black. He is the senior pastor at Stirling Baptist Church, one of the largest Baptist congregations in the whole of Scotland. He lectures on church history at the University of the West of Scotland and has written very widely on the issues of theology, divinity, and how these topics relate to the contemporary world. He's also someone who you will hear regularly on radio, so I'm sure a podcast will be far from a new experience to him. So Alasdair, it's great to speak to you today.
Great, Tom. Good to be here.
Now, one of the reasons we're going to be chatting today, of course, is about the release of your brand new book, The Courage to Speak. And now this is an absolutely groundbreaking book, actually, one that I've thoroughly enjoyed working on in terms of getting it ready for publication, because it's a book that I think very skillfully delineates the differences between sexual behaviour, sexual attitudes, and the various different ramifications that these topics, sometimes quite contentious topics, have on social attitudes in the everyday world, because of the way that the Bible and the Church deal with these topics. What was the genesis of the project?
Well, I think part of it is in the title, Courage to Speak. I think Christians, and we find it difficult to talk about these subjects, and as part of that, we tend to either adhere to a kind of blind orthodoxy in these questions, or what happens is we say nothing because we don't know how to respond, and we don't know quite what appropriate response is, and now we're even afraid to respond because of the way we may be misrepresented, or we may be challenged, or we may be cancelled effectively. And so I called the book The Courage to Speak because I think we do have to talk about these issues. I do think as a society we have to talk about them. I think as Christians we have to talk about them. And I think we have to apply our faith and the Bible to these questions. But that's a dangerous thing to do in our present context. And certainly, as you say, it can be a controversial thing to do. And it was out of that sense of we need to talk about this stuff that I did a sermon series in my church, which really began to look at what the Bible teaches about sexuality. And out of that, and some of the discussion that arose, this book came.
So we hear a lot in the present day about cultural Christianity. We've seen public figures from Elon Musk through to Professor Richard Dawkins discussing these nuances and the way in which cultural Christianity is now being proffered as something where people, I think perhaps, and I don't want to oversimplify the term, but they may perceive benefits to religion in society without themselves sharing the viewpoints of those religious views. Do you think this presents a challenge to religious orthodoxy in the present day, or do you think it has potential to guide people on a religious journey of their own?
Well, I think it's interesting that secularists, you mentioned people like Dawkins, who has certainly not been a fan of the church and Christianity over the years, recognise that there is a value and an importance in terms of the values that Christianity reflects. And I think it's important that as Christians and as a church, we reflect those values into our society. And again, not in a way that is a demand for an orthodoxy, but in a way that says, let's talk about this, let's think about this, let's look at the questions of your own living and own experience, and work out what is the best way to express human sexuality in the context of our society and in the context of our lives.
Because that is a really interesting question, and I think one which your book deals with in a very, very effective way, of course, is the fact that attitudes, social and cultural, do have a tendency to change and to shift generationally. You often see biblical scholars, for instance, talk about the way that cultural values are negotiated. Do you think that will also be the same for sexual attitudes? Do you think that there is a shift being undertaken not just in modern society but in terms of religious views as well?
Yeah, massively, and obviously we're influenced by our society and the values that are around us and how we speak in relation to those values. But in terms of the Bible, I mean, I always say that there are three things that you do when you come to the Bible and what it teaches. Is first of all, you look at what's there, and that's really just a description of what's this talking about, what's it saying. And then the second question we have to ask ourselves is, what did this mean to those who wrote it? What was their intent? What were they trying to convey and impart to us? And the question is this just something for that culture and for that time? Or is this something that was a universal principle that they're introducing for humanity at all times, in all places, and all peoples? And then the third question we have to ask ourselves is, how does this apply to us in our context and the questions that we have today? And for sure, the questions that we have about sexuality today are very different, not only from the ones that they had in the Bible, but from the ones that we maybe had 50 years ago. But the Bible still has a relevance to those questions. And I would hope that, I mean, in this book, I show that there's still a relevance, even if you don't necessarily agree with everything it says, that at least you begin to grapple with, how does this relate and what does this have to say to us in terms of our situation?
Yes, because that's a really fascinating topic, isn't it? I mean, looking at it from a literary scholar's point of view, the most amazing thing about the Bible is, irrespective of whether people follow its teachings or they reject its teachings, there is very little doubt that it is a book that changes attitudes. It is a book that speaks to people now in just as profound a way as it would have done when it was first written. And of course I say that looking at it as a collection of over 60 books rather than just as one single text. What is it, do you think, makes the Bible so accessible and yet so transformative?
Well, I think it represents a voice from beyond your own situation. Sometimes we get so locked into our own situation, our own culture. We talk about echo chambers where we just hear our own voice, and those voices are fed back to us. And we never hear anything challenging, never anything distinctive, never anything that causes us to question what we're doing and the way we're choosing to live. And the thing about the Bible is, it provides that voice that transcends culture, but also then finds a way of expressing itself in culture. And this is the profound thing that the Bible has done throughout history. It has brought something that transcends a culture, yet it also speaks into a culture. And as it does that, it brings a transformative effect to culture. And again, it's a tragedy. And I think one of the problems of the modern world is we have lost that voice.
Yeah, because that is an interesting thing, and one that I've seen discussed actually on a number of occasions, is the fact that the Bible as it stands now and has for the last couple of 100 years is a book that continues to really engage people, irrespective of what version of that book they may be reading, whether it includes, for instance, the Book of Enoch, or whether it doesn't, whether it includes the deuterocanonical texts or not, you know, the Apocrypha. It fascinates me actually that the 66 books that comprise the modern Bible seems to be so cohesive and has weathered the storm of vast cultural change in those 2 centuries. I mean, do you perceive the Bible as it stands now to continue in its current form? Do you think there's still negotiation to be had?
So I think that we live in a relativistic age, which essentially means that we think all truth, all right and wrong, is a social construct. So we make it up, and really truth can be whatever we want it to be. Right and wrong can be whatever we want it to be. And if a group of us choose to believe one thing or to live in one way, who are you to criticize that or condemn that? And that's the world that we live in, this relativistic age. But the truth is that The relativism is ultimately relativistic, or to put it another way, there are no absolutes except there are no absolutes, because there is actually a reality that fancies our existence. And that reality has parameters, and you can choose to ignore that reality, you can choose to deny that reality, you can so create a social reality that you obscure that reality. Nevertheless, the reality persists. And I believe the enduring significance and relevance of the Bible to our lives is that despite what society may choose to do, the Bible still describes the reality. In other words, it makes a truth claim. It is the truth, and therefore you cannot just ignore it. And by ignoring it, it doesn't stop being the truth. It continues as the truth. And that's why the Bible still has a relevance. And even if you don't believe it's the truth, you still have to, I think, or you should still engage with it and consider its truth claims. Because if it is describing reality, and it is describing the way that things are, then to ignore that is an incredibly hazardous and damaging thing. And again, coming back to the question of sexuality, I would suggest that in our society, people have done harm to themselves and to others because we have ignored the biblical parameters in relation to our sexuality.
Which I think is a very, very powerful point that your book makes, actually. And that's one of the reasons why, of course, the book is so valuable, is the fact that, we live in a highly sexualized culture where sex is used to advertise products. It's used very much in the entertainment industry. It's very much something that is ubiquitous. And yet the Bible tells us that we must be careful of sexual urges, we need to be careful of sexual behaviour and the impact that those things can have potentially on our everyday lives. Do you think there is room for social change on these issues? Do you think it's a question not of religion adapting to these changes, but in a sense society adapting to the religious guidance? Is there a potential there?
Well, certainly culture has moved away from the parameters of truth that I've just described, or understanding truth in the way that I've just described it. And as it's done that, it's put experience really in place of the idea of a received truth. So your experience is your truth. And we've created a culture where if it feels good, you do it. And so that becomes the standard. And we assume that anything that is natural is positive. And therefore, if you have something that's a natural desire or a natural urge or a natural longing within your life, then it's acceptable to pursue that because it must be good, because it's natural, it's innate. And actually to try and suppress that or regulate that is unhealthy and counterproductive, and you're never to do that. And of course, we've lived with this philosophy now for more than 50 years, guiding and directing our culture. But I would suggest to you that actually this thinking has led us to a terrible place. And that for many people, their sexual experiences are predominantly negative. That actually, if it feels good, do it, has led people to terrible places and situations. And that maybe we need to go back and actually re-examine the biblical idea, which is that not all our innate desires are good. And that actually we have to learn to regulate and rein in some of those things for our own good and for the good of society. Because if we don't, then it damages not only our own lives, but the life of society and those around us.
We see at the moment, a lot of technological commentators have pointed out that there is a gradual shift away now from social media. And as a result, a gradual move away from things like echo chambers and sort of groupthink. And this interests me. I mean, some people have said as early as 2030, the existing models of social media will have evolved far away from the existing models that we have now. And we see this now, people under 30 who are gravitating much more towards individualised platforms that allow them to interact with their close group of friends, but not nearly with the larger circles of people that we see in social media. Do you think this will bring with it a potential now for people to kind of re-examine their lives in an individual context without that temptation towards collectivism that sometimes is inherent within social media?
Yeah, a lot of social media masks, I think, truth, and it becomes the noise that we surround ourselves with that helps us to recognize the truth, that those parameters that cannot be shifted no matter what we say. And I think a lot of social media functions in that way. And so it distorts our reality. But I think ultimately, and again, if we come back to our own experience guides us, I believe, towards the truth. Because we find that it's like if you tell a child that fire is hot, don't touch it, the child doesn't believe you, that's a social construct, and therefore the child goes out and touches the fire and is burned. And then the child learns the fire is hot and it burns you. And that then regulates behaviour. And I think as we experience things, it brings a regulating of our behaviours. And so while our society, certainly in the West, has moved away from Christian values and understanding of truth, I think our experience will lead us back there. So I envisage that there'll be a movement away from our present kind of approach to things back to a more conventional and biblical approach. I think, again, people will begin to discover the relevance again of the Bible. While they've rejected it, their own experience will lead them back to it, to say, let's look at this again, and actually, does this say things? Because if you look at what the book touches a little bit on pornography, but the endemic nature of pornography and the way that this now mediates people's understanding of sexuality and even its expression of sexuality, it's horrific, because we've developed a completely utilitarian use. We turn people into objects that we use rather than people with which we engage. And ultimately, that becomes vacuous. And people will say we want something more. We actually want human connection. We want to relate to one another. We want to be more than just insensitive, animalistic individuals responding to intrinsic desires.
And I think that's a really very significant point, because more and more now, certainly amongst physicists, there has been a lot of discussion about the nature of reality. We see everything from quantum physicists talking about quantum entanglement, to discussions of string theory, to discussions about whether or not human experience is a kind of holographic projection. In essence, that we ourselves exist in a kind of encapsulated identity that is only perceivable really in and of our own experience, a kind of solipsistic experience. And yet the Bible tells us actually this is only one part of who we are, that the physical and the spiritual are two very, very different experiences. And indeed, even that our perception of the afterlife is very limited on earth, because there is so much to that existence that we just simply can't comprehend in this side of life. Do you think these big philosophical questions, which have puzzled people really since since antiquity and beyond, will continue to encourage people to ask these questions and to perceive in the Bible and indeed in other holy texts the answers that they need to seek?
I would like to say yes, but as I say, in the midst of social media and many other things, these are things that act as the noise, the white noise almost, that surrounds us, that stops us asking those deeper questions. So it's like we're suppressing through a kind of medication these realities in our lives, and by doing that, we never ask the big questions. So we keep ourselves busy all the time, or preoccupied all the time, or we keep our minds filled with those voices that are an expression of the echo chamber, rather than standing and recognizing our humanity and our experience of humanity in relation to God. And as I believe that's the truth, that's a reality that you can't escape even if you deny it, I think ultimately when we stop and we allow ourselves the space to reflect and to think and actually honestly analyse our own experience, then we find ourselves coming back to God. But in our society, and the problem with our modern world is the noise that drowns out the voice of God in the midst of our experience.
And I think I'm very glad you raised those topics, actually, because one question I feel I really must ask you is, we know that the Bible transforms lives. People have given witness to this. Now, you could make a case for saying that various other holy texts also transform lives. What is it specifically about the Holy Bible that gives people a unique outline, a unique blueprint for living their lives that continues to be as valuable now as people found it to be in days of antiquity? What is it about it, do you feel, that makes it such a coherent and powerful group of texts?
Yeah. Well, I would want to say that the Bible is more than just a moral book. It's more than a philosophical book. I would want to say ultimately, through an engagement with the Bible, we not only find the truth, i.e. the structure of reality around us, but we actually also experience a reality which transcends our world, which is God. So I think in reading the scriptures, we encounter God. And I think that whereas there are many other offers out there of religious philosophies and moral philosophies and things, nothing offers you the encounter with the living God that is gained through an interaction with the Christian scriptures. And obviously that's why I'm a Christian minister, so you'd expect me to say that, but that's certainly what I would witness to experientially, that people encounter the living God through his word. And I think we do that.
Well, Alasdair, thank you so much for having joined us today for a really interesting and wide-ranging conversation. I really hope that, irrespective of whether you hold to a Christian faith, or whether perhaps you come from a different faith tradition, or perhaps you have no religious faith at all, that you will want to read this book, that you'll want to engage with it, and that you'll want to respond yourself to the many really fascinating arguments that are raised and the really remarkable observations that are gathered together here, because it is a book, I feel, that questions so many things that are relevant to the present day and which relate timeless lessons to the nature of not just culture and society, but also reality, this nature of who we are, where we are, and how we relate to other people. So I'm very grateful, Alasdair, for you having shared your views today.
Thanks, Tom.
The Courage to Speak is currently available to buy from all good independent retailers and online booksellers worldwide, so I hope that you'll get your copy soon. Thanks very much for having joined us today. I hope that you'll tune in again soon.